The telegram arrived on an October afternoon when New York seemed to be holding its breath. The sky was low, not storming, not clear, just heavy enough to press against the tops of buildings as if the city itself were being weighed. The paper was thin, yellowed at the edges, folded twice, carefully, by hands that did not tremble. The message was short. As ye sow, so shall ye reap. The man meant to read it lay dying on a tiled floor in Newark, blood pooling beneath his shoulders, his breath coming in wet, broken sounds. Dutch Schultz would never see the words meant for him. But the words had already done their work. They had been sent, and the woman who sent them stood very far away, at a window, listening to the city breathe. She did not smile. She did not pray. She simply watched the light fade from the streets below, one lamp at a time, as though the city were slowly closing its eyes. Power, she had learned, was not loud. It did not announce itself. It moved quietly, like ink drying on paper. Long before New York knew her name, long before Harlem whispered it with awe or fear, she had been a child standing barefoot on wooden boards, listening to the sea. Guadeloupe, an island shaped by salt and wind, by ships that came and left, by promises that never stayed long enough to grow roots. She was born at the edge of the century, or close enough that the difference no longer mattered. Records disagreed. Dates slid past one another like loose stones. What remained certain was this: she was born into heat, labor, and silence. Her mother's name was Feliciane, a woman with hands always busy, washing, stitching, scrubbing away other people's dirt so her own child could eat. At night, when the island finally grew quiet, Feliciane would light a small lamp and read aloud from old French primers. Her finger traced each word slowly, patiently, as though sound itself had weight. The girl listened, not just to the language, but to the rhythm, the pauses, the spaces between sentences, the way meaning often lived where nothing was said. Outside, the sea breathed, a long, endless exhale. Sometimes storms passed far out on the horizon. The sky would flash, distant and brief, and the girl would imagine other places beyond the water, cities where lights did not flicker out, where hunger was not a season. Feliciane used to point toward the harbor at night. Each light, she said, belongs to someone who left. The girl watched those lights until they disappeared. She learned early that leaving was a kind of courage. School came. Briefly. A missionary teacher noticed how quickly the girl learned. Numbers came easily. Words stayed where she put them. She could remember prices, faces, small details others lost. But cleverness does not soften hunger. When Feliciane fell ill, the lessons ended. The girl began working, selling fruit, carrying water, washing clothes until her fingers cracked and bled. The house grew quieter. The lamp burned later. The breathing from the bed became shallow, uneven. The doctor came once, left a bottle of medicine, never returned. When her mother died, the island did not stop. The sea kept moving. The markets kept shouting. The sun rose and fell with indifference. Neighbors buried Feliciane with white flowers and murmured kind words. Someone said the girl was smart, that she would survive. Survival, the girl learned, was not a gift. It was a decision. She stood by the grave until the others left. Then she turned her back on it. The port spoke in whispers. Montreal, New York. Names carried by sailors, by crates of sugar and rum, by men who never stayed. She saved coins in a tin box, each one placed carefully, like a promise made to herself. At night, she packed and unpacked the same small bag, rehearsing the act of leaving. One evening, she did not unpack. The air smelled of rain and molasses. The ship waited, ropes slick with spray. Men shouted in French and Creole, loading barrels under swinging lamps. An old woman from the market called her name. "The sea remembers everything you give it," the woman said. The girl nodded. Then she stepped onto the gangplank. The deck trembled. The island shrank into shadow. She felt nothing, not sorrow, not joy. Only a stillness, like the space between two heartbeats. The journey north taught her about cold, about silence without warmth, about nights where the ocean groaned like a living thing beneath thin walls. In Montreal, the air cut her lungs. Snow fell without sound. People hurried past her as though she were invisible. She learned new words: bread, street, work. She wrote them in a small notebook. Employers shook their heads at her skin, her accent. Some laughed. Others pretended not to see her. Loneliness settled deep, like frost in bone. Still, she endured, because endurance was something she had been trained for. She heard eventually of Harlem, a place where music never stopped, where people like her walked openly, where ambition sounded different. She bought a train ticket. As the train crossed south, snow clinging to the windows, she whispered to herself very softly, "I will never be poor again." New York did not welcome her. It swallowed her. Smoke, noise, movement without mercy. The city surged around her, a living thing made of hunger and speed. She wandered at first, watched faces, learned patterns. Italian boys selling papers, Jewish tailors bent over threadbare coats, black families carrying everything they owned in their hands. The city was an empire of pursuit, everyone chasing something, most never catching it. She found a narrow room that smelled of coal and boiled cabbage, found work when she could, sold small things, buttons, lace, ribbons. At night, she wrote letters she never sent. "I am safe. The river freezes here. The lights look like stars trapped in glass." She folded the letters and hid them away. Spring came. With it, Harlem. The first night she stepped onto Lenox Avenue, music spilled into the street like breath. Cornets sang, laughter rose, warm and unguarded. The air smelled of fried fish, perfume, and sweat. For the first time since leaving the island, she felt something loosen inside her. Belonging, she realized, was not comfort. It was recognition. She rented a small room above a shop, watched the street breathe, learned its rhythms, learned where people gathered, where money moved quietly from hand to hand. She began to dream again. Then came Duke. He wore charm like a coat too fine for the weather, spoke easily, knew everyone, or seemed to. He told her stories of Harlem's hidden life, card games, back rooms, easy money whispered between drinks. For a while she listened. For a while she believed. Then the sweetness sharpened, the demands crept in. The silence between words grew heavy. When Duke vanished, shot in a dispute no one bothered to explain, she felt only relief. Relief was a kind of clarity. Ed came after. Younger, reckless, hungry in a way that frightened her. Their partnership was brief, profitable, dangerous. The night he died, rain pressed hard against the windows. Voices rose, a chair fell, a glass shattered. Silence followed. The city absorbed another body without pause. By morning, she was gone. When she returned, weeks later, she was someone else. She had changed her name. Madame Street Claire. The title was not vanity. It was armor. She watched the numbers move through Harlem, saw how hope traveled faster than money, how chance itself had become currency. She learned, she planned. And when the time came, she built. Quietly, precisely. By the time Dutch Schultz turned his eyes north, Harlem already belonged to her in ways he did not understand. She would not fight Chaim with guns. She would fight him with patience, with records, with memory. Now, standing at her window, the telegram already sent, she listened to the rain begin at last. Slow, steady, cleansing nothing. The words she had written moved through wires and hands unstoppable. As ye sow, so shall ye reap. She closed her eyes, not in triumph. In exhaustion, outside, the city exhaled, and somewhere, a storm ended only to make room for another. New York did not strike all at once. It wore you down, day by day, hour by hour. in small humiliations that left no visible wound. Madame Street Claire, though the name had not yet fully settled into her bones, learned this early. Harlem welcomed her warmth, but the rest of the city remained indifferent, a massive body that moved without noticing who was crushed beneath it. She walked its streets with measured steps, listening more than speaking, watching how people survived. Survival had rules here, unwritten but absolute. Never linger where money changed hands. Never look surprised. Never ask a question that could be answered by silence. The city rewarded those who learned quickly. It punished those who did not. Her days began early. Before the sun fully cleaned the buildings, before the streets filled with sound, she would sit by her window and listen to Harlem wake. Milk carts, footsteps, a distant piano practicing scales, each note slightly off, stubbornly repeated. She dressed carefully, not to impress, to disappear. Clothes neat, but unremarkable. Shoes worn just enough to suggest work, not poverty. She learned that extremes invited attention. Attention was dangerous. She worked where she could, cleaning, delivering parcels, selling small goods, but she never mistook labor for loyalty. Employers replaced her easily. She replaced them in her mind just as quickly. At night, she walked. Harlem after dark was not the Harlem visitors spoke of. It was quieter, watchful, a place where laughter could turn sharp without warning. She learned where the numbers men stood, where slips changed hands folded inside hymn books, where policemen paused longer than necessary at certain corners. She said nothing. Learning, she had discovered, required silence. Duke came into her life the way many men did in Harlem, without warning, with confidence unearned. He spoke as though the city belonged to him, as though streets bent slightly when he passed. His coat was too fine for his income, his smile too quick. He noticed her. That alone made him different. They met outside a tavern lit by a single red lantern, its glow uneven, trembling in the night wind. He tipped his hat, said her name, as though tasting it. They talked. At first, it was harmless. Stories traded like coins. He told her where music lived after midnight, where cards stayed on the table until dawn. She listened. She always listened. Duke mistook listening for admiration. Men often did. For a Timé, he showed her the city's softer edges. Cafes where jazz spilled thick and sweet into the air. Late walks through Central Park, where lamplight fractured across dark paths and the city pretended to sleep. He spoke of fortunes made overnight, of men who rose simply by daring. He called her clever, said she was wasted on small jobs. She wanted to believe him. Belief, she would later learn, was a luxury. The sweetness did not last. It never did. Soon came requests framed as affection, risks dressed as opportunity. He wanted her to help Haim, to hold money, to speak for Haim when he could not. The first time she refused, he laughed. The second time, the laughter vanished. She saw then what he truly wanted, not partnership, but control, not admiration, but obedience. When Duke disappeared, shot in a gambling dispute on a street that did not remember his name, she mourned briefly. Then she folded the feeling away. Grief was another luxury. Ed followed. He was younger than Duke, hungrier, reckless in a way that frightened her. He moved too fast, spoke too loudly, dreamed in extremes. Where Duke sought charm, Ed sought conquest. They met by accident, or something close to it, at a diner thick with grease and smoke. He sat beside her without invitation, talked as though silence offended him. She almost left. Almost. Curiosity stayed her hand. Ed spoke of business, small trades, quick money, nothing permanent. He said he needed someone calm, someone who could count, someone who didn't panic. She agreed to meet again, not out of affection, out of calculation. Their partnership grew quickly, too quickly. Money arrived in small bursts. Cash folded warm from hands. They rented better rooms, bought better clothes. Ed grew bolder with each success. She grew quieter. At night, she counted their earnings alone. her pen scratching softly across paper. Numbers behaved. Numbers obeyed rules. Ed did not. He spoke of guns, of rivals, of the future, as something that could be seized rather than built. She warned him. He laughed. The city, she knew, had little patience for men like Ed. The night everything broke, the rain fell hard enough to drown out distant sounds. Their voices rose, accusations sharp, careless. A chair fell, a glass shattered. Silence followed. Neighbors later said it was an accident, a fall, bad luck. She did not correct them. By dawn, she had vanished again. When she returned to Harlem, she was changed. Not visibly, but something inside her had hardened, like wet clay fired in heat. She changed her name, Madame Street Claire. The title carried weight, distance. It suggested authority without explanation. Under that name, she began to observe Harlem differently. Not as a visitor, as a strategist. She saw how the poor did not gamble out of foolishness, but desperation, how hope itself had been monetized. She watched the numbers game closely. The slips, the runners, the ledgers. It was not chaos. It was a system. And systems could be mastered. She began small, acting through others, watching patterns, learning which figures appeared more often, which days paid out heavier. She read financial pages each morning, clearinghouse reports, figures most people ignored. Numbers whispered to her. They always had. She hired her first runner quietly, then another, paid them fairly, spoke plainly. Trust grew faster than fear. By the time her name began to circulate, half whispered, half admired, she had already secured her footing. Harlem did not crown her overnight. It noticed her slowly. Success brought visibility. Visibility brought danger. Whispers began drifting north. Of men downtown looking for new territory. Of white gangsters who saw Harlem as unclaimed. She heard the name Dutch Schultz before she saw its shadow. She prepared quietly. Moved money. Tightened operations. Warned her people to stay alert. When the envelope arrived, slipped beneath her office door, she read it once. Meet or pay. She tore it in half. That night, Harlem felt wrong. Laughter too loud. Movements too hurried. The storm had arrived. Schultz did not creep in. He announced high himself. His men appeared first. Well-dressed. Heavy-shouldered. Watching without drinking. Then he came high himself. Broad, pale. A violence that seemed always just beneath the skin. He made his demands plainly. Runners defected, storekeepers wavered. Some chose survival over loyalty. She did not blame them. Fear was persuasive. Violence followed. Windows smashed, men beaten, warnings delivered in blood. She moved constantly, slept in different rooms, hid when necessary. Once, she spent an entire night beneath a pile of coal in a cellar, her breath shallow, her body rigid with cold fury. By morning, she emerged, brushed herself clean, and walked back into daylight. The newspapers began calling her defiant. Harlem called her brave. She felt neither, only tired. The war ended without her firing a single shot. Not by her hand, by forces larger than both of them. When Schultz overreached, when he threatened men too visible, too protected, the decision was made for him. The night he was shot, the city barely noticed. When she read the news, she said nothing. She wrote the telegram slowly. As ye sow, so shall ye reap. She signed it simply, Madame. Now, standing at her window, rain washing the streets clean, she felt no triumph, only a deep, hollow quiet. Victory, she had learned, was another word for survival delayed. Harlem would breathe again. The city would move on. And she would remain, watching, listening, calculating. There was a moment quiet, almost invisible, when she stopped reacting to the city and began shaping it. No one noticed when it happened. There was no announcement. No blood spilled to mark the transition. No sudden rise that could be pointed to afterward and named. Power, she had learned, did not arrive with sound. It arrived with routine. Madame Street Claire rose before dawn. Always before dawn. The city was different then, unguarded, unfinished. Harlem breathed more slowly in the early hours, as though even its hunger needed rest. She sat at her desk with a single lamp lit low, its glow soft and controlled. Coffee untouched beside her, the ledger open. Paper had a smell. Ink did too. She liked that. Physical things behaved honestly. She read the financial pages first. Clearinghouse numbers. Market closings. Figures buried in columns no one else bothered to read. Most people saw randomness. She saw patterns. The numbers did not predict the future, but they narrowed it. That was enough. Her operation grew quietly. Not outward, but inward. She tightened discipline, reduced noise, removed anyone who talked too much or moved too fast. She paid promptly, paid fairly, paid without drama. That alone set her apart. In a world where cheating was expected, honesty became reputation. Runners spoke of her with respect. Storekeepers defended her without being asked. Even those who feared her did so carefully. Fear, when controlled, was useful. She never raised her voice. She never threatened. She let certainty do the work. Harlem learned her rhythm. Morning. Slips collected. Midday. Figures tallied. Evening. Payouts delivered. No delays. No excuses. When someone won, they were paid the same day. When someone lost, they were treated with dignity. She understood something most men did not. People did not gamble for money alone. They gambled to feel acknowledged. A nickel was a small price for hope. She respected that hope. Her office reflected her mind. Clean, spare, orderly. Curtains always drawn halfway enough light to work, not enough to expose. The scent of lavender faint but persistent. A clock ticked softly on the wall. Tick, tick, tick. It sounded like control. So many times, she sat listening to it, doing nothing at all, letting the city move without her intervention. Restraint, she believed, was the truest form of authority. Men came to test her. They always did. Some with charm, some with threats disguised as negotiation, some with laughter that did not reach their eyes. She treated them all the same, politely, briefly, without concession. When one man suggested she could not possibly manage such an operation alone, she smiled. "I don't," she said, and that was all. The conversation ended. Loneliness crept in slowly, not as pain, as absence. Friends became employees. Conversations became transactions. Even admiration carried an edge of calculation. At gatherings, people laughed around her but never quite with her. She felt it in the slight pauses, the careful phrasing. She had become someone to be managed. That was the price. At night, she sometimes walked alone through Harlem, her coat buttoned, her pace measured. People nodded as she passed. Children stared. She caught her reflection in dark windows, composed, immaculate, unreadable. The island girl was gone. So was the frightened migrant. Only Madame remained. Whispers followed her. Some said she carried a revolver in her handbag. Others swore she could recite every winning number from memory. Neither was true. She allowed the stories to circulate. Legend was cheaper than protection. By the middle of the decade, her operation had become an unseen infrastructure of Harlem. Money moved through her hands without ever touching them. She wore tailored suits now, soft fabrics, muted colors, luxury without excess, power that whispered. Still, power attracted attention. Men from downtown began to watch. They stood too long at corners, asked questions with false politeness, smiled without warmth. She noticed. She always noticed. Dutch Schultz was dead, but his kind did not vanish. They adapted. She tightened her records, moved funds, ensured that nothing could be taken all at once. Redundancy was survival. At night, she reviewed her ledgers carefully, pen gliding through figures. Numbers did not betray. People did. Sometimes she dreamed of the sea. Not the storms. The stillness. The way the horizon dissolved into possibility. She woke from those dreams without longing, only acknowledgement. The life she had chosen did not allow for return. The law came quietly. Not with guns. With paper. Committees formed, hearings announced, names printed in small columns. At first, she read the news as one might read weather reports, important but distant. Then her name appeared. Not accused, not praised, noted. That was worse. When the summons arrived, sealed and formal, she laughed softly. It felt almost courteous. The courtroom was colder than she expected. High ceilings, hard benches, men in dark suits holding pens like instruments of dissection. They watched her as she entered, measured her, judged her before she spoke. They had expected something else. They always did. The questions came quickly. How long had she operated? Who worked for her? Had she bribed police officers? Had she been threatened? She answered calmly. Yes, the police took money from others. Yes, raids targeted black operators disproportionately. Yes, she kept records. At that, they paused. Records unsettled them. She produced papers from her handbag, neat, organized, precise. Names, dates, amounts. She spoke without anger, without apology. She let arithmetic do the accusing. When she finished, the room was silent. Even the stenographer hesitated. The press devoured her testimony. They called her unexpected, reluctant, a paradox. She ignored them. Vindication, she knew, was temporary. Power simply shifted forms. Arrests followed. Careers ended quietly. Some thanked her. Others cursed her. She accepted neither. Truth, once released, did not belong to its speaker. Afterward, Harlem felt altered. Not safer. Just different. People looked at her with something close to awe. Distance widened. She had crossed a line that could not be uncrossed. At night, she sat by her window again, listening to the city breathe. The clock ticked. Tick, tick, tick. Time, she realized, was the only force she had not mastered. She sent flowers to funerals she did not attend. White lilies. Always anonymous. She did not believe in absolution, only accounting. As winter approached, she walked through Harlem alone one evening. The lamps glowed softly through mist. A church choir practiced nearby. The melody was familiar. She paused, listened. For a moment, the city receded. She thought of her mother, of the lamp, of the sound of pages turning. When the song ended, she moved on. Her shadow stretched long before her. Queens, she understood now, could not belong to crowds. They could only endure them. Back at her desk, she opened the ledger one last time that night. The pages glowed softly under the lamp. Numbers marched in perfect formation. Outside, the city murmured its restless hymn. She dipped her pen into the ink, paused, and smiled. Not with satisfaction, with acceptance. The city never announced when it turned against her. There was no warning siren, no single event that could be pointed to afterward and named. It began, instead, with subtle misalignments. A delay where none had existed before. A door that remained closed half a second too long. A silence that lingered after her name was spoken. Harlem still moved to her rhythm, but the tempo had shifted, only slightly. Enough to matter. Madame Street Claire felt it first in her body. Sleep no longer came easily. When it did, it fractured short intervals stitched together by shallow breathing. She woke often before dawn, heart already alert, mind already counting. The clock still ticked on the wall. Tick, tick, tick. But it no longer soothed her. It reminded her that Timmy, unlike money, could not be delayed. The numbers continued to flow, but differently now. Not weaker, not smaller, just heavier. Each envelope carried weight beyond its paper. Each payout felt less like routine and more like obligation. People depended on her not only for money, but for stability, for order, for the illusion that someone, somewhere, understood how things worked. She had become that someone. She had not planned for this. Power, she realized, had a way of expanding beyond its original design. Men she did not recognize began appearing more frequently. Not criminals. Not yet. They wore clean coats, smiled politely, asked questions that sounded harmless until repeated. How long had she lived in Harlem? Did she feel responsible for the neighborhood's well-being? Did she consider herself a leader? She answered carefully. Leadership, she knew, was a word often used to justify punishment. The police changed. Not openly, but their posture did. Less deference, more distance, a casual authority that suggested they were no longer uncertain about where they stood. Raids became more frequent, but oddly selective. Her competitors suffered. She did not. At first, this felt like protection. Then she understood. She was being isolated. Isolation was dangerous. It removed camouflage. It turned symbols into targets. She adjusted accordingly. Reduced visibility. Shifted operations. Limited movement. She began sleeping in different places again, not from fear, but prudence. Once, late at night, she stood by a window in an unfamiliar room and watched fog roll in from the river. It swallowed the streets slowly, deliberately, until even the lamps looked unsure of themselves. She felt a strange recognition. This was what decline looked like, not collapse. Drift. Bumpy Johnson came to her quietly. He always did. Tall, thoughtful, careful with words. They spoke in her parlor, the curtains drawn, the city murmuring beyond the glass. He did not flatter her. He never had. The streets are restless, he said, not violent. Just tired, she nodded. Fatigue was another kind of instability. People are watching, he continued, not for weakness. For succession, the words settled heavily between them. She had not considered it seriously. Power had never felt temporary. Now it did. They spoke long into the evening, not as rivals, as realists. She listened as he outlined what she already knew but had not yet accepted. She had become too visible, too symbolic, the kind of figure history preferred to correct. Let me handle the streets, he said finally. You remain the name. She considered this. Control without exposure. Authority without motion. It was a compromise, she agreed. The transition was seamless to most. Bumpy's men appeared where hers withdrew. Debts settled quietly. Violence, when necessary, became surgical. Her name remained on the lips of Harlem, but her presence faded. This, she discovered, was another kind of loss. She spent more time alone, walking through rooms that felt too large, sitting at her desk with no immediate task. She read more, wrote less. Sometimes she opened old ledgers, tracing figures that no longer mattered. The numbers remained perfect. She did not. The law did not forget her. It never did, committees concluded. Reports published. New laws drafted. The city congratulated itself on reform. She read the headlines without expression. Reform, she knew, rarely changed who paid the price. One morning, she woke to find her accounts frozen. Not seized, paused. The difference was unimportant. It suggested negotiation. She smiled faintly. The city, it seemed, was ready to collect. Meetings followed. Men in offices that smelled of polish and ambition. Conversations polite, carefully framed. They spoke of order, of progress, of cooperation. She understood the language well. It was the dialect of surrender disguised as civility. She agreed to terms slowly. Each concession measured. Each retreat planned. She would keep enough. She always did. Harlem adjusted again. The numbers game shrank, became quieter, less bold. The Renaissance dimmed. Jazz still played, but the edge was gone. The nights ended earlier. The city was tired. So was she. One evening, she walked alone through Harlem for the last time without purpose. Past the bakery, past the tavern with the red lantern, now extinguished. Past the corner where Duke had once laughed. Nothing marked the places where lives had ended. The city erased efficiently. At a church, voices rose in song. She stopped, listened. The melody was imperfect, human. She did not enter. Some thresholds, she knew, were no longer meant for her. At home, she packed a small case. Not to leave the city, just to be ready. Readiness had become habit. She placed a ledger inside. Not the most important one, just one she liked. Outside, the city exhaled. The clock ticked. Tick, tick, tick. She extinguished the lamp. Darkness settled without resistance. Later that night, she dreamed of the sea again. This Time. It was calm. No ships. No lights. Just horizon. She woke without regret. Power, she had learned, was not lost all at once. It was surrendered in increments, each one small enough to justify. By morning, Harlem belonged to someone else. Not officially. Not yet. But inevitably, she remained, watching, counting, accepting. After power leaves, it does not announce its absence. It lingers. In habits, in posture, in the way a person still listens for footsteps that no longer come. Madame Street Claire learned this slowly. There was no morning when she woke and felt lighter, no clear line dividing before from after, only a gradual thinning, like fog lifting from a street that no longer needed concealment. Harlem still knew her name, but it no longer needed it. Her days became quiet, not empty, just unclaimed. She woke early out of habit, though no runner waited, no ledger demanded attention. The clock still ticked on the wall. Tick, tick, tick. She did not replace it. Some rhythms, she believed, deserved to end naturally. The city moved on with practiced indifference. New faces appeared, new alliances formed. Men who had once lowered their voices when she passed now spoke freely again, their laughter unguarded. They were not ungrateful. They were relieved. Relief, she understood, was not betrayal. It was survival. She bore them no resentment. Resentment required energy. She conserved what remained. Money still existed. Enough of it. Hidden carefully. Layered through institutions that preferred not to remember how deposits had arrived. She lived comfortably, but without display. Wealth, stripped of ambition, was merely insulation. She no longer needed armor. Sometimes Bumpy visited. They spoke sparingly. He told her of the streets, how order now held, fragile but intact, how younger men tested boundaries with familiar eye impatience. She listened without judgment. He did not ask for guidance. She did not offer it. Their understanding required no instruction. At night, she sat by the window again, not to watch, to listen. The city had changed its sound. Less jazz, more machinery, the rhythm sharper, more efficient. Progress, she supposed. It lacked poetry. She did not miss the chaos. She missed the meaning. There were letters, invitations, occasional requests from journalists eager to reshape her into something useful. She declined all of them. History, she believed, should be written by those who did not need to explain themselves. Silence, in the end, was her final assertion of control. She walked less now. When she did, she moved unnoticed. This pleased her. To pass unseen through a place that once bent itself around her presence felt like a private victory. She visited the market once. The same smells, different faces. An old woman selling fruit looked at her carefully, as though searching for something she could not quite name. Madame Street Claire paid, thanked her, and moved on. Recognition was no longer required. At home, she opened old notebooks sometimes, not to read, to remember that remembering was optional. She burned some, kept others, not for legacy, for herself. The sea returned to her thoughts more often now, not as escape, as origin. I imagined the island unchanged, indifferent to everything she had become. The wooden house, the lamp, her mother's voice reading aloud. She did not romanticize it. Memory was not mercy. It was simply proof. One winter morning, frost traced patterns along her window. She stood watching it melt as sunlight crept in, thin and pale. For the first time in years, she felt no urgency, no calculation. Just Time, moving without demand. It frightened her briefly. Then it did not. The city did not mark her passing. No headline, no notice. She preferred it that way. When illness came, it was quiet, unremarkable, the kind that arrived without drama and stayed without explanation. She prepared as she always had, methodically. She arranged her papers, closed accounts, gave instructions where necessary. She left no confession, no apology. On her final evening, the city hummed as it always had. Cars passed, voices rose and fell. Somewhere, a radio played a song she did not recognize. She lay still, listening. The sound reminded her of the ocean. Steady, endless, indifferent. She closed her eyes, not in fear, in completion. The next morning, Harlem woke without noticing the absence. The numbers continued to be called, the streets filled, life moved forward, efficient and unconcerned. Somewhere, a clerk closed a ledger for the last Time. Somewhere else, a child listened to music spilling from a window and believed the city would always sound that way. History adjusted. It always did. What remained of Madame Street Claire was not a monument, not a myth, not even a warning. What remained was influence, diffused and untraceable, a method, a standard, a quiet proof that power did not need permission and dignity could exist even in the margins. She had not conquered the city. She had survived it. That, she knew, was enough.